Hello. Good evening. If everyone could take their seats, we're going to begin. Welcome. My name is Vanessa Varden, and I am the director of the Chicago Forum on Global Cities here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone for today's program. I'd like to extend a special thank you to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting for arranging the exhibition of the stunning images by George Steinmetz on display in our conference center tonight. So if you haven't seen them after you checked in, please do give them a look after the program. They're absolutely wonderful. Also, thank you to our members in attendance today. Your support makes programs like these possible. If you are not a member, please consider joining. If you have any questions about membership, in the back of the room at that 6-foot table, there will be a young professional ambassador. Following the program, you can see them and ask any questions you might have. Today's program is part of the Council's work on global cities. Save the dates for the 2019 Chicago Forum on Global Cities, scheduled for June 5th through 7th, 2019, and visit chicagoforum.org for continued updates. Before we start, please note, views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Today's program is on the record and being live streamed, so please silence your phones, but keep them handy as we will be taking questions through our online survey technology, the link to which you can find on the screen on either side of me. Just open your web-enabled device and type in chi.cnf.io into your browser and select today's program to submit your questions for consideration. And Siri. I hope you've had a chance to view our speaker and moderators' biographies on the screens, but please allow me to highlight some of their notable achievements. George Steinmetz is an award-winning photographer. He has worked with National Geographic on over 20 articles and 3 covers since 1987. He was recently featured in the New York Times Magazine's climate issue, Losing Earth, the Decade We Almost Stopped Climate Change. The images that accompany that article are the ones on display this evening. Larry Price is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer with over 35 years of experience. He currently partners with the Pulitzer Center to produce projects on child labor and global pollution efforts. Karen Weigert is a senior fellow for global cities here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, before which she was the chief sustainability officer for the city of Chicago. And she was also a producer and writer for the documentary film Carbon Nation, which we'll hear more about shortly. And finally, our moderator, Jon Sawyer, is the founding director of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and previously had a 31-year career with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. We're trying a bit of a new format this evening, something we hope you'll enjoy. So each speaker will give a flash talk about their work, followed by a moderated discussion with Jon, and then audience Q&A as normal. So don't forget to submit your questions via chi.cnf.io. And with that, I would like to welcome George Steinmetz for our first flash talk.
Thank you. A year ago in June, the New York Times called me and they asked me to photograph a project for them about climate change. Can you hear me okay? They wanted me to photograph the effects of climate change on every continent. As a photographer, it was a great gig, but it was kind of an eye-opening experience for me. They asked me to try to find the best examples of the effects of climate change on every continent. And so I'm going to take you through the past year of my life in about 5 minutes. I started in Greenland, and this is up on the, actually this is not what I wanted to be the first picture, is it? Yeah, well, it is the first picture now. On the Greenland Ice Sheet, and I went out with some scientists working for the National Science Foundation, and they were trying to study how the ice sheet is melting. And what they discovered was that about 60% of the ice loss in Greenland is not by the glaciers calving into the ocean, but them actually melting in place. And they were trying to study how that happens. And what you're seeing here is a dye experiment. They were studying the rivers on the ice sheet and how they disappear down holes called moulins, and they go all the way down to the bottom of the glacier as it works its way to the sea. Oh, hold on. Let's get this to work. The video's not working. I'm sorry. It's like that sometimes. This is in the Bernese Alps in Switzerland. And the Bernese Alps are losing ice at the fastest rate of anywhere in the Alps. They estimate that by the end of this century, there are only about 10% of the ice remaining, glacier ice left in Switzerland. And this bridge you're seeing here is the Trift Bridge, and it was built because the glacier used to cover that chasm. I talked to the guy who owned the little guest house near here, and when he started 20 years ago, you could walk across the ice, and as the ice disappeared, now it's thousands of feet above it's retreated thousands of feet above the level of the bridge, and now people have to walk across. And I think, let me see if we can get the video to work on this. It's a drone video. It's working. I work a lot with drones because they let me visualize a story like this in a new way, and it's particularly interesting for video because this is something you couldn't do with any other kind of technology. The next stop for me was China, and this is inside the largest coal mine in Asia. It's called Herwusu. And it's hard to get an idea of the scale of this pit, but that truck is about the size of a 3-story house. China consumes about half of the coal in the world, and it supplies about 60% of the requirements of the national power grid. And this is a field where they sort the coal that goes to the coal stations. You'll see in the background is that's Tuo, which is it's the biggest power station in China. It supplies about 30% of the power for Beijing, and this is where all the coal comes to be stored before it goes into Tuo. Those little blue buildings down there are what they drive the trucks full of coal into, so they can sort it out by different grades. And the green cloth is covering. It was been a rainy morning, and it was trying to keep the coal dry. When I see scenes like this, it drives home to me just the enormity of what's going on in China, the transformation of China, which is now requiring more and more power as it tries to rise to the level of consumption that we have here in the United States and in Europe. This is looking at downtown Shanghai at rush hour, and you get an idea of the power demands of this rising economic superpower. What's even more frightening to me is thinking about the use of automobiles in China. This is looking down on that same bridge. And when you think of what would happen if 1.3 billion people wanted to have as many cars per capita as they have in the United States, the concept is a little bit frightening. And China is also experiencing the effects of climate change. This is an algal bloom on Lake Tai. It's one of this third largest freshwater lake in China. And because of warming temperatures and the increase of agricultural runoff surrounding the lake, it has a terrible problem with surface algae in the summer months. And here it's getting caught in fish traps. It kills almost all the aquatic life off during the summer months. This is a suburb of Santa Rosa, California, after it had been wiped out by a wildfire. Because of the prolonged drought in California, there were a lot of dead trees, and when they had really high winds, it blew the dead tree limbs onto the power lines, and it was a rapidly moving fire that cleaned out this entire neighborhood. What was really freaky was walking through the streets after I took my aerial photographs and looking at like this car. The fire was so intense that it melted aluminum hubs off the wheels, and they were flowing like candle wax down the street. Because of climate change, we're seeing more intense tropical storms, and this is Houston, the first day after the hurricane departed. And it rained 40 inches in 4 days. It was about 40 inches is a typical annual amount of rainfall for Houston, and the water just literally had no place to go. In Beaumont, Texas, it rained 18 inches in 18 hours. And this scene was particularly freaky for me when I saw that swimming pool, because it was typically when you see a flood picture, it's like a river overflowing the banks, but here it was just like somebody left a shower on and there was no place for the water to go. This is Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, and it's experienced repeated flooding much in the same way as Houston because of warming water in the Bay of Bengal. There are more intensive rainstorms, so you have stronger monsoons and much stronger storms. This is upriver from Bangladesh, from Dhaka, in the Brahmaputra River. These people were recovering from the flood. The waters were receding. In the Brahmaputra Delta, they have to live very lightly in the land because this is seawater, and it's within inches of the rice paddies. It's almost wiping out their way of life. This is in Antarctica, and I went down there in a sailboat. We were in the first boat in the season, and the sea ice was disappearing very quickly, and that was having a really dramatic effect on the penguin populations. Penguin populations have declined by about 40% in the past 15 years, and it's because of climate change that the populations of krill are decreasing. Krill depends on algae that grows in the bottom of sea ice, less krill, no food for penguins. This is in Shark Bay in Australia. Shark Bay is having marine heat waves. It's wiping out the seagrass. And it's also affecting people in Africa. This is in Chinguetti. It's a oasis town in Mauritania. But slowly, for centuries they've had a problem with blowing sand, but now the sandstorms are becoming more intense, and the town is slowly getting buried. This is the capital of Mauritania, Nouakchott. It's a brand new road in the outer suburbs, and it too is getting buried in sand. Since the end of the colonial era, since the beginning of the end of the colonial era in 1960, about 30% of the population of Mauritania has moved to the city. It's basically a capital of climate refugees. So, flash talk, 5 minutes.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us out. And again, I want to thank the Chicago Council for having us here today to talk about some of the important journalism that the Pulitzer Center is funding. And I got to say, it's such a privilege to work with the Pulitzer Center. For the past 2 years, I've been involved with a project to document the health effects of global pollution in from a variety of sources. And let's see, we got the wrong slide. There we go. Okay, sorry. So here you see a lead smelter in Kabwe, Zambia, which is probably the most polluted place in Africa, and certainly in Asia. The lead dust creates particulate pollution, which brings us to the issue of PM 2.5. With continuing support from the Pulitzer Center, we're producing a 5-part series for Undark magazine about the adverse health effects of PM 2.5 on people around the world. Undark is a nonprofit digital magazine supported by the 9th Science Fellowship Program in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT. For the series on PM 2.5, we traveled to India, Bangladesh, China, Nigeria, Chile, and soon California, and to Macedonia. So this project is still in progress. And we chose these places because they have some of the worst PM 2.5 pollution in the world. So what is PM 2.5? Why is it so deadly? PM 2.5 refers to particulate matter that is 2.5 microns in diameter or less. Think about a human hair. That would be 1/30th the diameter of a human hair. The reason it's so deadly is because PM 2.5 can go right into your deep tissues through your lungs and create a host of cardiovascular, respiratory conditions, even cancers. PM 2.5, it's largely attributed to 4.2 to 6 million premature deaths every year. Coal-fired power plants, auto exhaust, Wood-burning stoves, open trash fires all produce massive amounts of PM 2.5. This is a massive mountain of burning trash outside New Delhi, India, polluting huge swaths of North Delhi. Indoor cooking fires, they exacerbate the pollution. This woman is using a coal-fired cook stove, and coal is one of the worst fuels that you can use in relation to health. Patna, India lies in the pollution belt that stretches from Mumbai in the west, beyond India, all the way to Bangladesh. And in Patna, almost 365 days a year, a perpetual haze obscures the sun. This was in China. This is in a manufacturing region southwest of Beijing, maybe 300 to 400 miles. This is one of my favorite pictures from this series. This hasn't been published yet, but it's a brand new statue of Chairman Mao saluting a polluting factory, off in the distance. A little metaphorical. This was taken in the city of Onitsha, Nigeria. And I wanted to document this region because it produces PM 2.5 from e-waste recycling and thousands of burning fires that go in these landfills and dumping areas all around the city. So what they do, they burn everything. They burn trash. They burn waste from slaughterhouses nearby. And here they're burning the electrical covers off of copper wire for recycling. This is in Lagos, Nigeria. This is a poor neighborhood across from Victoria Island, which is a very wealthy part of Lagos. But in this area, every morning dense smoke wafts up from these cooking fires that start pre-dawn, and the residents cook their breakfasts, cook their meals, and then they smoke fish for sale, in the markets. This is their livelihood. Chile. The problem in Chile is that in this area that I worked in, many of the homes, 95% of the homes in this one area, used wood stoves for indoor heating. Well, that creates, indoor pollution, that, is sometimes higher than the pollution outdoors. Up to 40% of the children in Coyhaique, the capital of Patagonia, have asthma. This is a shot of the woodcutters. The other problem, of course, is that that much wood cutting in this region is not sustainable. So the woodcutters go high into the Andes Mountains to cut wood, bring it back, sell it to the residents. So you have this ever-expanding ring of deforestation. This little girl in Coyhaique, she has to wake up every morning. She goes through 4 different asthma treatments every day. This is taken about 6:30 in the morning before she goes off to school. And of course, pollution caused by traffic. This is in Dhaka, and this is the dense traffic, that you would see typically, all hours, day and night. One of the things that I was documenting in Bangladesh were the brick factories that are responsible for up to 60% of the PM 2.5 pollution in Dhaka itself. They burn fuel, some wood, but 95% of the fuel that produces the bricks is coal. So they're polluting the entire region. And of course, the workers, they have very little protection to no protection. Many told me that they didn't realize that, breathing in the fumes and the coal dust and working in such, dusty conditions was even bad for their health. One of the things we're doing on this project is incorporating a little bit of 360 video and some drone work. George had some spectacular drone photography, and the beauty of that is it gives you a little bit. It gives you a little bit of an edge when you're trying to show some of these massive facilities that you can't shoot from the ground. This will give you an idea of what one of the brick fields that I worked in looks like from the air. And here you can see the 90-foot tall chimney and then the coal smoke that emanates and wafts over the neighborhoods. There are about 1,000 of these factories around Bangladesh, and almost all of them support little communities, where the residents have to breathe in the toxins. And this was a new experiment for me. This is my first foray into the technology, which is really nice for websites. 360 video. When you look at this on the Undark site and you go into the player, you can actually use your mouse to click around 360 degrees. So what we did, we'll just did an edit and clip together some of the the best clips, and then we put data points in there and description so you can see what's. Here you can see some of the extreme dust that's kicked up when they're cleaning out the kilns. Okay, thank you very much.
So even the video wants to be seen. So I'm Karen Weigert. Thank you to the Pulitzer Center and obviously to the council and for my fellow panelists. I'm here to talk about Carbon Nation, which is a film I made on solutions to climate change. And we made the film because we were interested in the simple question of what could people do. And there was a little coverage about climate change when we started, and most of it was negative. And you really didn't get a sense of action, of possibility. Now, at the time, I had an MBA and had worked as a strategy consultant, which is another way of saying I didn't know how to make a movie. So we were going to write an op-ed because that's what you do when you're in the world that I was in. But what we realized is we wanted to make solutions real. We wanted to get people past politics and into possibilities. And what that meant is we really needed to do some storytelling. And so to do that, we needed people to be able to actually see the solutions, to actually feel and emotionally connect with what was possible. And so we met a director, and our op-ed became a film. So I'm going to show you two clips. The first will be the trailer, the one that very enthusiastically tried to get started. Then I'll come back and I'll show you one more.
Climate change is, in fact, a national security issue. We need to change how we think about this.
Do I think man is causing global warming? No. That doesn't make any difference. I want clean water and I want clean air. And that's so simple.
We've been doing it one way for the last 100 years, but we've got to be thinking about what's the technology for the next 100 years.
This is a very complex, high-tech operation. You take the extension cord, plug it into the car.
The lights are on right now geothermally. It cost me about $12 a day to refrigerate this place. If you did it on diesel fuel standard, it would be $750 a day.
For Roscoe, I guess we bottomed out when we lost our Dairy Queen. We sat here and prayed for rain and cussed the wind. Now what we've been cussing all these years turned out to be a blessing.
There's no question that these technologies are going to grow very quickly. The question is who's going to get the business.
China is likely to be there well ahead of us.
What we need to be worried about is whether or not we're keeping up with them.
I see the United States having almost a full employment economy based on retrofitting a nation.
You don't have to be concerned about climate change or terrorism or anything. You don't want to drive at 10% of the cost of what you're driving at now.
So if you don't give a damn about the environment, do it because you're a greedy bastard and you just want cheap power.
You might could say I did it all single-handedly, see?
It's the best thing that ever happened to me.
It's the most patriotic thing you can be, do, think, or feel today. Green Baby is the new red, white, and blue.
This is no longer the purview of Birkenstock-wearing tree huggers. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
So as you could see, we looked for some characters. And after this film was in theaters, a couple months later, I became a character because I got invited to become the first Chief Sustainability Officer for the city of Chicago. And so my theory here is that you have to find real people who can do real things, and then sometimes you have to become those people. And sometimes that's any role you can think of. What we had to do in making a film was to take these abstract concepts and really help people connect to them. So we actually interviewed a lot of experts, and most of them actually didn't make it in the film. We discovered when you're actually trying to do the visual compelling part, many people are not very interesting. But we found a few who were, and one of them you just saw there, and that's Cliff. And Cliff is a one-armed cotton farmer from Roscoe, Texas, who built the largest wind farm in the world. So I'll leave you with a little of Cliff's story.
For Roscoe, I guess we bottomed out when we lost our Dairy Queen.
Oh yeah, that's the kiss of death for a small town. When your Dairy Queen closes down, you're on your last leg.
But about that time, our wind industry came along, and it's been a fantastic, unbelievable boom to Roscoe.
Roscoe's got what will end up being, for a little while at least, the largest wind farm in the world, and there are 400 landowners in this area that are sharing in the benefit of that project.
The landowners get paid on the actual amount of electricity generated. Their payment is a straight royalty, and this is the only time they've ever had a chance to receive a steady income.
The thing that's really cool, you talk to a lot of the families that raised kids here, and you find out that a large percentage of them have children moving back to this area because of the wind industry.
Vicki Haynes really benefited from this wind farm. I hope you'll include her. She's a lot better looking than I am.
This is our daughter and our little grandson that it brought home, and my son-in-law and our little grandson. So Dan's the one working with the wind turbines, and it's just been a blessing.
Farmers really do appreciate these things. This is strictly dry land. We sit here and pray for rain and cuss the wind. Now what we've been cussing all these years turned out to be a blessing.
Thank you.
So, thank you all. Thank you all for coming out, and thanks to Council for hosting this event and for being such a great partner for the Pulitzer Center now and in the past. And I think we both share a real commitment to not only reporting, but also to education and outreach, to taking these important global issues to as many people as we can reach. And this is, I think this is a really fascinating trio of projects, because we were interested in looking at different, how you use visual approaches to capture attention on issues like climate change, global pollution, and these are very different approaches. The one thing, Larry's project with Undark magazine, he did mention, but Undark has a lot of interactivity in it. So when you go on the site, you see the monitors that will tell you exactly what the PM 2.5 emissions are in Chicago, or in Roscoe, Texas, or wherever, or in the cities that it's covering. So it's using the images that Larry took to bring you into the story. And in the piece that George did, Losing Earth, with the New York Times, you had this very unusual approach where the 31,000 word piece that Nathaniel Rich wrote was about the history of the 1980s. And when we had a moment back then when Republicans and Democrats almost came together to do something that would have had a huge effect on climate change, and they failed. And so you had that story, that history, 30 years old, juxtaposed against incredible images caught right now in more or less real time from all over the world of the consequences of that failure. And then in the wonderful film that Karen did on carbonation, you have these characters that are sort of giving you a way forward. So one question maybe to begin with is thinking about approaches, your own approaches to this. And we have sort of two examples of descriptive, very compelling, descriptive reporting, capturing the causes and the consequences of a big issue. And then we have a focus much more on solutions. And in your own thinking, your own approach to these types of issues, what resonates to you? In your choices as to how you went about it, tell us about the choices that you made.
Well, with the Undark project, we looked at hotspots around the world. So we looked at data, and then we decided on these 7 locations, 5 continents. So, we had a finite amount of time to get the material covered. So one of the things that we try to do is to identify each location and kind of look, take a microscope and look at what the consistency of the PM 2.5 was and what the source was. So we sort of broke every story up by theme. In Bangladesh, there are many sources coming out of that country in Dhaka. But I knew I wanted to go after the brick making industry because it constitutes this overwhelmingly large percentage of pollution emissions.
But in each case, the images that you were choosing, the subjects, were intended to draw you back to the kind of science, the data that was presented in Undark on what PM 2.5 was happening globally.
So we would take, we'd take the issue of coal, we'd take the issue of brick making, and then whenever the story is presented, you have the multimedia approach of, you can see it visually. We have the drone video, the 360 video, you can see the carbon, and then the story takes apart the science, the story and the graphics, the interactivity. So, right now you can call it up and it'll give you real-time, PM 2.5 readings, on the website right now. So it's a fascinating way to coalesce all this data and put it, into a reasonably easy way to digest, highly technical information, but you can kind of go into the site and you can follow your interest. If you're interested in visuals, they're great visuals. If you're interested in data, the data's there. If you're interested in narrative, and explaining the issues, that's all there.
And George, any project, the concept of the Times project, had you ever done anything like that before, and what did you make of it when they first presented it to you?
I'd done something for the Geographic about 20 years ago about the coming millennium, but It's very challenging to work on something on a global scale to try to pick out the best examples of a certain theme, and I had the whole world to choose from, but I had to find, I mean, for some things it was quite obvious, like for climate change you have to go and look at the ice sheets in Greenland and in Antarctica, but the rest of it was where do you go in Europe, where do you in Asia, where do you go? In Africa, it was complicated, and I had to find things that told the story visually from the air. And you can't, you don't Google that. You don't Africa climate change. And I spent a lot of time. The best thing in Africa is to call experts. But even like where I went in Mauritania, there's no weather station there. I'd actually been there 20 years before working for the Geographic, and I said, "Ooh, I know a really good place. They got a really big problem with sand, and I bet it's getting worse." And I actually got a hold of the mayor, who had been there for 40 years, and he said, "Oh yeah, he knew because he knows how much sand he digs out from in front of his house, so he knew." But it's complicated to find the right places.
You were doing it in real time. You had this more or less a 12-month deadline, and you had things happen. I mean, Harvey happened. The wildfires in Santa Rosa happened. So I mean, you were somewhere back or beyond in Africa when.
That's right. Yeah, I was. Yeah, actually, we thought that I wanted to cover a hurricane, and I assumed it'd be like in the Philippines. I didn't expect it to be in Texas, and I was in Tanzania giving a TED talk, and I was when I was boarding the flight for Tanzania, I was looking at my phone and saw this monster hurricane coming in, and then it stalled over Houston, and then I saw the rain readings when I saw that it rained the whole year's worth of rainfall in 4 days. And I called my editor in New York. I said, "I think I better get to Houston real quick," and I was the next plane out of Tanzania. And ended up getting on the first chopper into Houston, and it was extraordinary. It was heart-wrenching too. I mean, seeing what happened to the people there. But as a journalist, it was that was the story.
Yeah. Karen, making that movie now that's 2010, 2011. So it's sort of the early days of sort of focusing on the solution side of this. I mean, when you were thinking first in deciding how to go about this. Did you come in with that idea, or did that come to you in the course of the reporting? You said it started with an op-ed, but the focus, I mean, is a very different focus from these two projects.
Yeah, it was
an approach.
From the very beginning, we wanted to tell the story of what we could do. So it was anchored on solutions. And even then, so long ago, climate change was very political. It remains very political, which is very unfortunate. And so what we did is we essentially created the guidelines for this project, and it was that it was not going to be political, that it was going to be about solutions, and that it was going to be geared for a non-expert audience. We essentially built guiding principles for us. And that really shaped then what we wanted to do. And so within that, we knew we wanted to tell a story of solutions that a lot of people could relate to. They might believe in climate change, they might not, like Bernie Carl, who's in our trailer. But we wanted them to see the future and the possibilities of action. So that's exactly how we went into it. And then you have to do all this extraordinary research. Like, we didn't want to tell a story of solutions if the solutions didn't actually work or if they didn't add up. So we did all the behind-the-scenes research on the various kinds of solutions. We had all the best information on what are the things that do exist that need to scale that could, in fact, change the course of the emissions trajectory we were on. And that works great on paper, but then you have to find real people who can tell their stories about what they're doing. So you had to find somebody interesting in the renewables space, and we had to find someone who could talk about transportation. And we wanted to find people who were not the quote-unquote usual suspects even then. So we wanted to find people from different religious backgrounds, different political backgrounds. And the surprise story for me was we ended up with an entire segment on the Department of Defense as a climate hero, in a sense, for the work that they were doing. So yes, it was solutions from the very beginning. And we took it as a premise that climate change was real and then moved from there.
And the response to that approach, we had a question from the web, from I think a teacher working with students in exploring global issues. There can be some fatigue after looking at problem after problem and some frustration that the issues continue. So do you feel that in your work, and you have advice on how to counteract the fatigue and frustration? So this is one response to that. We find in our school work that almost invariably, whatever the topic is we're presenting, one of the first questions is always, what can we do? What can we do about something?
Yeah, it's amazing to have this conversation now. Obviously, we didn't solve climate change as a result of the film, but the Global Climate Action Summit, which was just in California, was 100% about solutions. So this idea that we've got to be more explicit about what's possible and engage more folks in that has grown and grown. And then in the middle, I ended up sitting in the mayor's office being part of the team that was trying to make these things happen here in Chicago. And that's one of the things that I've always found fascinating and found important is every field has a role to play in climate change. The visual storytellers, the songwriters, the engineers, the architects, the urban planners, there's a role out there for all of us. We just have to find them. And if we can help inspire someone to find that piece that they can play, we've done our job.
Well, but in a way, the work that Larry's been doing on that's talking about at the city level, the local level. It's the impact in your own personal health. Partly it's related to climate change. Obviously, not all of PM 2.5 is coming from climate change, but a good bit is. And you're trying to, I think I'm right, that you're trying to alert people to the fact that that they can do things that would make their health right now, the quality of life in the cities where they're living, much better. And if you do that, you're also going to be addressing big global climate issues.
Right. It comes back to, I think it's very simple. It's awareness. That's the big word right there, is that depending on, where you go on planet Earth, issues are, widely known. In many places, they're not. I mean, we tried to find locations that many people wouldn't necessarily, know about. Central Patagonia, for instance, Coyhaique, it's a little town of 60,000, but in 2016 it was named as one of the, the top 5 polluted locations on the planet. So, capturing those images, writing those stories, getting them out there, especially in a web venue that's as creative, as I think that Undark is developing, where you not only have the record and you have the explanation, you also have the ability to come back to the sites over and over again and look at real data and see how it evolves. So it's awareness, it's getting these situations in front of policymakers, people who can potentially make a difference. I feel like that's, what my job is to literally show it and then let people, digest that information.
I'm going to get to your questions in the room, but there's another good question here coming from the web audience. Maybe this is a good one for you, George, because your pictures are so much about the large-scale effects of climate change. And the question is that I can see how many of the images can be compelling and moving to those who are already concerned about climate change. What images do you feel are the most effective at helping to set the stage to sway a climate denier?
I think probably might have the most climate deniers in this country, and I think when you see its effect on the United States, I think it really hits home for people. It certainly hit home for me when I was walking through the suburbs of Santa Rosa, and I saw kind of a generic cul-de-sac suburban neighborhood, and every house had just been hammered, burned to the foundations. And or in Houston, seeing an oil refinery that was flooded out and had all the oil residue was leaking out into the bayou. And it just, when you see it in America, it brings it home, and it's very real. And to me, it was quite the statistics saying 40 inches of rain in 4 days in Houston. That's freakish. It's never rained that much before in the Gulf Coast. So it just makes it undeniable and brings it home to American audience.
Well, it's interesting. We had an event like this in New York right before the Times article came out, and Rafe Pomerantz, for those of you who've read it, was the environmental activist and Friends of the Earth back in the 80s who was one of the subjects of that story. And he was on the panel talking, and afterwards he was saying that his current work is focused in Florida on sea level rise. And it's for just that reason that he says you've got millions of homeowners who they live on or near the sea, and they're seeing what's happening. They're living the effect. They're seeing the value on their own property, and so that's an opening for a conversation that 10 years ago they weren't willing to have. But Karen, I want to come back to you on the climate denier question. I was looking at the great video strand that the council has, the wait just a minute, which Karen has done a number of, or some. And there was one where, and one of the questions was who would she most like to debate? And you said President Trump was an interesting choice, speaking of climate deniers, climate change deniers. But I was really struck by your answer, because you said that she wanted to talk to him about, ask him about his golf course in Ireland, because that's a place where they actually seem to understand what the effect would be.
Yeah, that opportunity to make something very personal and to connect. There's a Trump golf course in Ireland, and they actually put in a request to build a seawall, and they cited the issue being climate change. So the broader enterprise is protecting a golf course, and my hope is that we can gain much more from the climate change discussion, gain the jobs that we need, but really gain the broader protections that we need across our coastal communities here and across communities around the globe who are dealing with extreme heat, extreme weather, dislocation of their communities, risks to food supply, but to golf courses too.
So I want to open it up to questions here. Are we going to have a mic? Is there a mic back? Okay, right. Yeah.
So often, the people who don't believe in climate change will pack up the grandparents, their favorite aunt, and go. They believe the scientists to the minute when it comes to, say, an eclipse. Or they believe in the scientists to save themselves or a loved one with an illness. But when it comes to climate, how appropriate was the name Inconvenient Truth, because they'd actually have to do something. Americans love to be entertained, and I think some of your film has those aspects. There was a woman, a comedian on Colbert within the last 3 or 4 weeks, and she said she didn't want to take sides, but she talked about coal. And she said, I don't really know many millennials who want to be coal miners. And it went on from there, and it was a very funny routine. But I think if you use some humor to get them, they need the cold hard facts. People who want the facts will not stop watching. We watch that. But you also need, like the man with the wind farm, et cetera. That draws people in.
I appreciate that. I think, always in any kind of communication, one of the first things is, who's your audience? And so we explicitly were trying to reach a broader audience. We were not necessarily going for folks who were converted on climate change, but we also weren't going to folks who were explicitly denying climate change. We were trying to get a broad discussion about what's possible for our country. And we did intentionally try to find some humor. That's why a lot of people who were interviewed didn't make the film. But it is that idea of what's the way you're choosing to communicate. We have to reach a lot of different audiences in this, and you just see from the three of us who are here and the art that have been presented, we're reaching audiences in very different ways. It's going to take all of this.
So George and I were at the Yale School of Forestry 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's another one of our university partners. And Tony Lazarowitz there runs the Yale Climate Communications Program, and it was a really fascinating project where they're creating these 90-second radio spots 5 days a week, and they're mini climate stories, and they also try for humor, and they try for solutions, and they built this network of 300 or 400 public radio stations, many of them in kind of rural areas around the country, and they've gotten them to kind of insert these 90-second free spots right after the 7:30 news in the morning, and it's the idea of having sort of a positive message with lots of examples coming from places like Roscoe that people can see that people are grappling with the issue and doing something. Another question? Here.
Hi, I don't know if I'm going to do well with this question because it's along the same lines. Karen, I'm a fan of how you portray the challenge. George, I saw your work in the New York Times Magazine, and it's phenomenal what you accomplished in a year and what you stated, how you chose, and what you had to go through to make a real statement. Larry, I don't know your work as well, but George, the cover, okay, black, climate change, we fucked up 30 years ago, or something like that is the cover, right?
More or less.
Sorry. But really, was that an entree? Could you get in there? Could you read that? I really want to know how you felt about that year's worth of work and all you put into it, and the good intentions of the New York Times, and then what really happened.
You're talking about their choice of cover?
The cover and then the access, like how we could digest that and be with it, be with the problem to get to the solution. I mean, that was like a major platform.
So you say you found it disappointing?
I just want to know how you felt about it. I can't make a statement. I want to know how your statement, what you feel.
I've been in this racket a long time. And I go do my thing, and you go and you let them do their thing. And I thought they were trying to find a single picture. They actually, in the last leg of my journeys, they wanted me to come up with a cover picture, but it was very difficult to find a picture from the air that could summarize the concepts. So they decided it was best to do it with words. And long ago, I gave up being disappointed with magazines, how they used or didn't use my pictures. You go and you do your work, and they do their thing. And to be honest, as a journalist, you're kind of happy to have the job and have the opportunity to go and say things as best you can. But most magazines in New York, they take the pictures and they say thank you very much and close the door. That's how it rolls. So.
Well, I think the other thing that's interesting is that so much of the consumption of the article now is digital. So that in your experience of that piece, to me, was very different reading it online, sort of scrolling through and then having this drone footage, which was so powerful. The photographs were powerful, but then sort of opening it up to the drone footage. But on your point about the sort of darkness, the black cover, losing Earth, the Times, I think, to their credit, I think they really saw this as an opportunity, as a wake-up call. That look, we have to get serious about this. We have to address the moral dimensions of this in a way that we never have. And I've now been on 6 or 7 panels with Nathaniel Rich, and he's very good at sort of teasing out these issues and happy to address those who challenge one part of another of the piece. But the whole point, the reason Jake Silverstein, who's the incredibly talented editor-in-chief of that magazine, he wanted, that's what he wanted to do. He said, let's do something. If we're going to do this, if we're going to take the whole issue, let's try to drive a conversation. And so that's why we took it to Yale. We took it to the University of Missouri last week. We were at the Climate Action Summit in California. We're taking it to New Orleans. We're sort of taking it around the country. And we see, I mean, we're seeing that in terms of something that actually captures attention. We just had a workshop with teachers from here in Chicago upstairs this afternoon. And some of our great teacher partners who are here, who were teaching Losing Earth, and they're finding that it's I think working. So we're hoping that we can spread that further. But I agree, it's dark. It's a very dark.
I think that by doing that, it was it's very unusual for them. I mean, I think they were trying to make a statement like this is serious. It did look a bit like a tombstone when you saw it, but it's like this is a very serious thing, and to have them have a whole issue of the magazine devoted to one story, which they've only done once before, they were trying to make a statement, and I thought it actually was kind of, in a way, it's kind of like a museum. It can be like visually negative space to let the picture shine, and I felt they kind of did that by this kind of a very austere cover. So, and I say, I'm not saying that I do their thing, I do my thing, and they do theirs, and I thought it was a very powerful statement. It wasn't what I would have chosen, but that's okay.
Question over here.
Yes, thank you for the discussion. The efforts are being made here in the United States, and even people like Trump will come around when his golf course goes underwater. But I'm wondering, when you saw these things in Malaysia and in Africa, are things being proposed there? Are there action plans? Are there organizations? What's being done there to solve the problem? Because China is taking a very heavy-handed approach as the world's largest polluter. But what about these other places? There has to be an economic driver to the solution. You know, that guy making bricks, you can tell him he's polluting his lungs, but he's going to tell you, well, I have to eat, so I'm going to make bricks.
Actually, that's exactly what he told me. I have to eat, I have to feed my family was a fairly precise quote. Yeah, so you have that dynamic. You have these, these primitive working conditions, but those conditions have been there, for centuries. So that sort of thing doesn't change overnight. But the technology to the rescue, is what I hope, eventually cuts through the political rhetoric, and entities like the World Bank are putting a lot of money into some of these infrastructures where you can come in and retrofit these, those kilns, for instance. Those are the one I photographed, and the ones in those clusters were, 1800s technology, and with some small loans, for instance, these owners can go in and retrofit, the layout of the firing chambers, for instance, and they become instantly 80% more efficient. I mean, that's kind of the analysis. So imagine, the World Bank coming in, creating an initiative with the Bangladeshi government. They take 800 or 900 of those, retrofit them. Well, remember the data that I suggested that 40 to 50% of the pollution in Dhaka is due to the brick making during that season when they're doing the firing. Do the arithmetic, and you can see how much less pollutants would be generated. It's amazing.
I think maybe we have time for maybe one more quick one there, and then one more from the web. I think we're almost at time.
First of all, Mr. Steinmetz, I actually looked at your work when I was trying to do my own landscape photography. A little bit of your work was a little bit of an inspiration. But I'm sure all of you can answer this, but maybe Karen, you can answer this the best because you looked at solutions. And my question is, as technology advances and as the world advances, do you think technology is going to be more of a hindrance or a help in terms of climate change and sustainability as the world goes on, or as the world keeps moving, so would it make people more complacent, or do you think it'll help inspire people to actually use more sustainable practices through whatever means possible?
I think technology is a tool, and we all get to decide how we use it. So in some cases, the transition from, say, coal to renewables, that's a really clean one, to take all the different meanings of clean. But I'll give you an example that gets in the news a lot these days, and that's the question of autonomous vehicles. Is that going to be good, or is that going to be bad for the environment and for cities? Well, if the autonomous vehicles are all electric and they're shared, you'll have fewer cars, more open space, and there's the potential for that to link to the transit system, and then that has a lot of goods, with the exception of who lost their job, who was the driver, which we have to be very clear about. The other side of those autonomous vehicles are not electric, not shared, and you don't know where to park your car, so you just put it on auto and it drives around for 3 hours, and everybody else does that. Congestion is a disaster, emissions are a disaster, cities are much more difficult places to live in, climate change is exacerbated. So it's a tool. And I think that's the question for all of us, is what are the choices we make and how are we going to use them?
So maybe one last question. We have to do it quickly, but I'd love to hear from each of you. This is the question from the web. Of your respective experiences, what gives you hope and or discourages you regarding our ability to address climate change? Just think one example each, either hope or discourage.
I'll do a high-level hope, and that was, I'm going with the hope theme. That we made a film where we explicitly didn't try to talk about climate change, we tried to talk about solutions, and you can get just about anyone from any political persuasion excited about answers.
I think I'm thinking of a little bit of despair, to be honest. I tend to photograph in these situations that are so desperate and many times involve, children and, young adults. So, what I try to get by is issues of, opportunity and education. We're talking about technology. We're talking about how how we can put our best minds behind solving problems. But at the end of it, you have to consider culture, habit, necessity. We're talking about the workers feeding their families and so forth. So I tend to look at it as finding ways to stimulate on a micro level, and certainly in developing countries, ways to educate young people as they're growing up, and produce tomorrow's scientists, produce more teachers, people that come together and embrace, come head to head with their situation, and work in grassroots levels from grassroots levels to try to find solutions to those problems.
So, George, you have the deciding vote, hope or despair, based on what you've seen over the last year?
Well, in Nat Rich's story in the Times, he talked about Jon Sawyer, who was one of the guys who was really a critical person to kind of flip us into kind of climate change denial. Nat said he interviewed Sawyer recently, and he still believes, he's still a denier.
Right.
And I think these hardcore climate change deniers, you can't change those people. But our civilization is built on renewal, and the younger generation is largely about their climate change believers. And I think you really have to look at the young people to carry the change forward. And I do believe that technology is a big part of the solution. And when I go in and see, like with the Pulitzer Center, I went and saw kids in San Francisco, and they all want to know what they could do to make a difference. And I think that is our hope for the future.
Good. Well, that's a good note to end on, because it's near and dear to the Pulitzer mission. I know it is to the councils as well, to take these issues out to the next generation, because we need them. So thank you all. Thank you all for having me.